Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the 7Artisans autofocusing 35mm F1.4. Now, it's been fairly common for us to see autofocusing lenses available for under $200 in recent history. However, those are typically either f1.8 or in some rare occasions f1.7 lenses. But Chinese lens maker 7Artisans has pushed this envelope even further, bringing us an autofocusing 35mm f1.4 lens for Fuji X-mount. Fuji's own 35mm f2 lens cost $400 US, while their 35mm f1.4 cost $600. The 7Artisans, it can be had for right under $170 US. And while it has its flaws, as we will detail, it is a perfectly usable lens and it can produce some very nice images. So if you are on a tight budget, should you consider the little 7Artisans? Well, let's jump in and let's find out. We'll start by taking a look at the build and handling. And the first thing that really stood out to me about that when I took the lens out of the box is just how small and compact this lens really is, particularly for an f1.4 lens. It is 68 millimeters in diameter, or 2.67 inches, but it's only 49 millimeters long at 1.92 inches. And if you view it from the right side, you can see that it really doesn't stick out all that far past even the grip on my Fujifilm X-H2 body. It weighs in at only 184 grams or 6.5 ounces, and up front we have somewhat uncommon 62 millimeter filter threads. Doesn't mean that there aren't 62 millimeter filters out there or other lenses with it, but it's less common than the more common 58 millimeter and 67 millimeter filter sizes that bookend it in either direction. Now, the lens I think that is probably the chief competition to this lens and what I will kind of benchmark it against is the similarly priced Viltrox AF 35mm f1.7 Air lens. And these two lenses, as you can see in size, they're just made a little bit different. The Viltrox lens is about 4 millimeters narrower in diameter, but it is also about 5.3 millimeters longer than what the 7Artisans lens is. And so once you do the math, they work out to be roughly similar in their overall internal volume, just they get at that at a little bit different way. Now, the 7Artisans lens is a mixture of very nice materials here. It's a mix of mostly metals with a few plastics. It has a metal lens mount. Most of the barrel material feels to be metal, and I think even from what I can tell, maybe even the manual focus ring here is also made in metal, or it's a high-grade plastics. But either way, the build materials are really quite nice for this price. This is a really basic lens. There is no switches, unfortunately, here on Fuji. There is no aperture ring, nothing like that. And all you have is the manual focus ring. And that manual focus ring itself, it moves with its damping a little on the heavy side and is unfortunately so often the case on Fuji. It also focuses not in a smooth linear sweep, but instead in little chunks or steps along the way. And so it doesn't really feel like a true manual focus experience. And I find that a little bit hard to get precision because I feel like I have to do like a little jerk and a little jerk and just kind of step to where I get to the right place. And so I don't love it for anything like a manual focus pull, for example. Now, here towards near the base, we actually have a little rubber gasket that is covering a USB-C port where you can do firmware updates. I have seen 7Artisans do some firmware updating in the back, though they're not as aggressive with that as some other brands that I have seen. You do want to be very careful when you take off that little rubber gasket, as it is sealing from moisture and dust getting into that port there, and it's small and it's easy to lose, so just be careful and don't do it. As you can see, a petal-shaped lens hood is included. It's made out of decently thick plastics, and it bayonets on with pretty good precision here, with not necessarily a loud click, but a definite little bit of a lock there where it's not going to easily break free. Inside we have 7 aperture blades, but they are not rounded. In fact, as you start to stop the aperture down, as you can see here, you can definitely start to see the aperture blade shape pretty quickly, and it is not a round shape. Minimum focus distance is 35 centimeters, and it produces a rather average 0.12 times level of magnification, as you can see here, which is not great, but it's enough to be useful in certain situations. And of course, the price tag of $169 US makes this a tremendous value, possibly the cheapest f1.4 autofocus lens that I've ever seen. Moving on to autofocus. Autofocus is an area, unfortunately, of some weakness here. While I've seen 7Artisans most often use STM or stepping motors, there is no listed motor size here, but I'm pretty familiar with this sound. That sounds like a micro motor to me. And so unfortunately it's a bit loud and it's a bit buzzy. As you can see here that the overall speed, it doesn't necessarily look too bad in this test, and it's not bad, but what I did notice that you may not pick up from that is that when I begin to half depress the shutter button to start autofocus, there would be a bit of a lag before autofocus then moved. Once it started moving, it moves with some decent rapidity, but what you can see is that there's a little bit of pause in between, and that pause isn't me waiting, it's while it kind of spools up. And so unfortunately that does limit the overall focus speed in general. I found that at large apertures, I had good focus accuracy with still subjects. It would lock on and it would deliver well-focused results, whether it's photos of the cats or photo of people or photos of inanimate object. As long as they weren't moving too much, it focused okay. Unfortunately, focus won't keep up with action if it requires any kind of reactiveness. So in this shot of Ferrari, as he started to walk, as you can see, focus lagging is just way back. It's not where it should be. Unfortunately, I ran into a secondary issue that seems to be reserved to my XH2. I didn't see this reported by other reviewers on other cameras, but I actually, in testing 2 copies of it, I found that at focusing at small apertures like f5.6 or f8, that it did just a lot of hunting back and forth without being able to really lock on to a subject at all. And so it was quite frustrating, and I'm hoping that a firmware issue will fix that. But as you can see in these shots, there's just sometimes when it's settling on focus and nothing is in focus because it's just hunting, looking for a contrast point to attach to, and just doesn't seem to do it. So I would say that used in the ordinary or the easy scenarios, focus is fine, but it's certainly a weakness for this lens. Even if you're doing like street photography, if you're doing street photography, definitely do it at under f2.8. If you're shooting f1.4 to f2.8, you're probably okay. But if you're shooting at smaller apertures, I would not want to be in the scenario where it's hunting back and forth, and I missed the shot because of that. So unfortunately, autofocus for stills it's limited in what it produces. So how about autofocus for video? I found that focus pulls were okay. Now Fuji definitely has some issues. One of those issues that frustrates me is that touch to focus is pretty unreliable, and sometimes you touch and the focus box moves to a new area, but it's like there's a lag before focus pull begins, and that's certainly not unique to this lens. I've seen it with a lot of lenses on Fuji, but it is a reality here that you can also see there's some steps and some adjustments. It's not really a great focus pull back and forth, but it's not terrible either. You can see some moderate focus breathing, but nothing particularly bad. I was expecting a poor performance when it came to my hand test, where I alternately block and remove my hand. And what I found is that it actually did fairly well, which goes to show once again that with Fuji's tracking, it seems to do better when there is an AI detectable subject on the frame. And so anyway, it did a better job with that. Autofocus it's definitely a weak area for here, and I'm hoping that it will get refined some through firmware updates in the future, but the lens is now released to the public, and I haven't seen that firmware update yet. And so this is the state of play that I have to report on here at this point. So now let's jump into an image quality breakdown, and I will follow this up with a deep dive, but right now we'll just kind of jump into the overview here. This is a very simple optical design, 8 elements in 5 groups, and it seems to follow what has often been 7Artisans' philosophy in their optical designs, is that they're going for the simpler, in some ways almost like an old school type design philosophy, where it's less about complete corrections and extremely high contrast. And so there's a look there. It's a little bit lower contrast, a little bit more dreamy. Some people are going to love it, some people are going to hate it. I looked hard and I could not find an MTF chart, and that's unusual for 7Artisans, so it's probably not an accident. I doubt that the MTF really looks fantastic, and we'll get to that in just a moment. I did find in testing for things like fringing that there is some situational fringing. But more in the form of lateral chromatic aberrations rather than the longitudinal style that come before and after the plane of focus. I saw a little bit of that kind of fringing, but more of the lateral style that comes near the edges of the frame. I suspect that this has to do a lot with the optical design, where it's not as corrected for contrast, and so in more difficult high contrast situations, you will get a little bit more of the blooming on textures and a little bit of fringing that's there, but it's not terrible either. When it comes to some other things, I found that the distortion was mild. There's a bit of barrel distortion. I used a +7 to correct. Nothing terrible there. And also moderate vignette, particularly for an f1.4 lens that is so small. I used a +57 to correct, so right around 2 stops, which, not too bad. When I went to test for sharpness, I found that the center is reasonably sharp, though with lower contrast. The mid-frame is a little softer, but the corners are extremely soft. And I tested a few times to see if I was getting accurate results, and it seems like I am. I will say that the lens, when you're in the typical places where you're shooting at, which we'll call that the rule of thirds area of the frame, in lower contrast situations, it looks sharper. I would say acceptably sharp, and so I had no concerns with that. But if you put it in more dynamic situations, higher contrast situations, it looks a little bit softer. It doesn't hold up as well. What I found is that if you stop down to f2.8, the center becomes sharp and much higher contrast. The corners are still lagging a fair bit, and they don't sharpen up until about f5.6, but they're never exceptional. Sharpness, however, continues to improve, getting a little bit better at f8, and while diffraction starts to become an issue at f11 and f16, because the lens keeps sharpening up, again, which is kind of an old school quality, diffraction is actually less of an issue, because in many ways, I think like it's sharper, particularly across the frame at f16, than what it is at f1.4, for example. Usually my experience with modern lenses is it's pretty much the opposite of that. When it comes to the bokeh quality, again, it's very situational. In some situations, I think it looks great. Like some of these shots of Nala on the bed, the background is really soft and creamy. She looks quite sharp. The images are gorgeous. And if I was just, looking at that, I would say bokeh is fantastic. There's other situations though where the bokeh is a lot busier. And there's also an issue where the specular highlight shape is not great. Some people like odd shapes in specular highlights. I'm not one of those people, so if you're one, then fantastic. Another issue that is pretty common with these 7Artisans lenses is that I don't think they have a lot of great coatings, and so they do tend to be more flare prone. And so in certain situations, you're going to see a variety of different flare artifacts that will be an issue there. I did test for coma, and what I found is that it doesn't look like coma is too bad, but there is some fringing that shows up on bright star points, and then what happens is in the corner, it's hard to even see how much coma is there because the corners are so soft that the star points are really not all that distinct anyway. And so if you look at the image globally, I think it's usable. I wouldn't say don't shoot for night sky or star shots, but it's certainly not a top tier lens for that either. So my conclusion is this. I would say that it's what I am amazed by is that there is a reasonably competent autofocusing 35mm f1.4 lens that I can produce some very nice images with that can be had for under $170 US. That is just amazing. However, if you want more modern optical sensibilities, sharper contrast, sharper details, then I think you probably are better spending your money on the Viltrox AF 35mm f1.7, which from modern standards is the better lens and certainly the better autofocusing lens. However, if you like a more vintage look and your dream lens is a lens that has the qualities of vintage glass but with modern autofocus, then the 7Artisans AF 35mm f1.4 might just be the lens you've been looking for, and you're not going to have to pay much to get it. Now, if you want more information, you can check out my full text review that's linked in the description down below. Also links to an image gallery and some buying links if you want to purchase one. And if you would like to take a deeper dive into that unique optical signature of this lens, then jump in with me right now. Let's take a look. Okay, we'll start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. You can see some pretty classic barrel distortion there. Nothing extreme and fortunately very nicely linear. And so here I've dialed in some correction, a +7, and you can see it corrected up just fine there. Also some vignette largely concentrated in the corners. A +57 was what it took to resolve all that. None of this is an issue at all, zero problem there. Now, longitudinal style chromatic aberrations were largely situational, and so here there's a little bit of fringing, but nothing too bad. You can see just a really mild amount of kind of purple fringing in some of those areas, but I did see a lot more of the lateral style chromatic aberrations, and those will pop up in different kinds of ways. You can see that they're persistent enough that they're not just concentrated here, but a lot of times any place you'll have a high contrast area, you'll see some of that lateral style chromatic aberration, so that is unfortunate. Now, while I didn't dive into this in the formal review, it is worth noting that I am doing all of this on the 40 megapixel sensor of my Fujifilm X-H2. That's a hugely demanding platform, the most demanding that I test on, over 90 megapixels equivalent of a full, that's what you need on a full frame camera, which doesn't even exist. And so lenses like this, I mean, it's almost unfair to test them as I do on this, but of course, no one said life was going to be fair. So here we have at 200% magnification on that 40 megapixel sensor. You know, the center is not bad. Contrast is not high, as you can see. Mid-frame, again, the amount of detail there is not too bad, but you can see it's dropping, as is contrast. And as we pop down towards the bottom, you can see that the image quality is getting really soft towards the corner. You know, it's soft on this side as well, up into this left corner. I would say it's better than that lower right corner, but still pretty soft and low contrast. Now, the truth of the matter is that it's rare at f1.4 on an f1.4 lens to shoot where you need sharpness all across the frame. So on a more practical level, here, this shot of Nala, you can see again, contrast and detail isn't off the charts, but it's perfectly adequate to produce a very nice looking result with a good three-dimensional quality there. Likewise, in this shot, obviously I've used depth of field just to create some depth to the image itself. And again, as I look over here, contrast isn't high, but for this kind of shot, I don't mind the look at all. I think it looks just fine. Bottom line is if you really want sharpness and contrast, you're better served by choosing the Viltrox 35mm F1.7. I'll release a subsequent video where I really detail between these two, but you can see it's just a radical difference in terms of the contrast available wide open. And by the way, the 7Artisans doesn't look any better if I stop it down to F1.8. And so in these comparisons, it really doesn't matter where you look. The Viltrox is pretty noticeably sharper and with higher contrast all over the place. And with a three-dimensional subject like here, I just wanted to give you a look at a real-world scene, kind of real-world rendering here. So it is just a very different kind of look. I kind of equate the 7Artisans approach to a more cinematic approach, with the Viltrox approach to being a more modern, corrected type result. So you can see if you're talking about resolution and contrast, it is no competition. The Viltrox just kind of blows it away. However, I would say that the three-dimensional quality looks pretty good here on the 7Artisans, and of course the background is just kind of this generally softer. Look at the chair, for example. If you compare those two, the contrast makes the chair pop and stand out more, whereas it's a little more blended into the background with the 7Artisans because of that lower contrast. It really is a taste thing. Now, in stopping down to F2, you see a little bit of improvement in the center of the frame. A little bit of improvement here, not much, but the jump from F2 to F2.8 is pretty significant in the center of the frame. And so you can see a lot more contrast, a lot more detail. That's starting to be true in the mid-frame, but not quite there. You'll see a bigger jump by f5.6 here in the mid-frame where you can see contrast is jumping way up. And now if we look up here in the corner is not sharp by any stretch of the imagination, but it is sharper. And so it's making progress. It's also the rare lens that I find where the resolution continues to get better after f5.6. You can see that it is sharpened up further from f5.6 to f8. And again, now the corners are not sharp, but sharper. But if we look back here in the center, the contrast is even deeper at f8 than what it was at f5.6. This also means that diffraction doesn't hit quite as hard because the lens was soft to begin with, and it kind of just continues to gain contrast as you stop it down. So yes, you can see that there's less contrast at f16 than what there was at f11, but this is still better than what we saw even at f2, for example. And we can see, looking off into the corners, that really the corners are looking probably the best that they have, even at some of the sharper apertures, smaller or larger and sharper apertures for the center or the mid frame. Now, we really shouldn't expect the up-close performance to be super high contrast because the lens isn't particularly high contrast. You can see it's not bad. It doesn't really pop at all, but neither is it bad at close focus distances. And so again, you just take a look at the rendering and some real-world shots. The amount of fur and detail here, I don't see any problem with that at all. And then if I look at the background, in this setting, I would say the background is very nice and soft, and I think the foreground is pleasing. This shot here as well, I think it looks great. And again, you can see, the contrast and detail isn't just the page or anything, but it's sufficient that if you look at the image globally, the way that 99% of people are going to look at it, it just looks fabulous. Everyone would say, oh, that's really sharp. And it is, it's just not really high contrast. Now, this image is stopped down to f1.8, and you can see, because of depth of field increasing a little bit, you can see that the focus is not just, the focus is on the eyes, but the area of focus extends out just a little bit further. Background remains nice and soft. This image too, I think, the overall impression is positive, what I would like. The background's defocused. It's more the bright kind of specular highlight that draws my eye a little too much. And that's one of my general complaints, is that specular highlights, they're just okay. I mean, if I look at them, they're not too busy here. Shape isn't too bad wide open, but as we begin to stop down, it's just this kind of very odd shape. You can really clearly see the aperture blades, but then on the side, it just, that rather than that rounding, it just kind of continues to squeeze. Here we're finally starting to get round, but it's not really round. Obviously, it's a different kind of shape. This image here with a lot in the transition zone, it's a little ugly to me. It's just way too busy, and so it's not handling that more complex background very well. This image, however, I think the scene works, and again, because it's snowing, there's kind of a natural softening effect in general that I think plays really well with the look of this lens. The colors, I think, work with the optical glass, and so it's in some ways it's kind of a nice winter lens. This shot too, I mean, if I look at this portion of the image, if I was looking like from this section over, I would say I really like the look of that. It's when the scene gets more complicated, more hard edges, that the lens just doesn't handle that very well. As we've noted, flare resistance is a bit of an issue, and we're going to see it's concentrated when the bright light is near the edge of the frame. And so you can see here, again, near the top, we're starting to see that pretty significant ghosting pattern. Again, here, it's, just kind of reversing the polarity of that, but I mean, that's destructive. But if you compose with it not near the edge of the frame, but here in this shot, there is a mild ghosting pattern here, but it's not nearly as destructive. Finally, when it comes to chroma, if I look here in the center of the frame where things are not super bright, it doesn't look too bad. You can see in this point where there's a brighter light, and then if we look down here towards the Big Dipper and more prominent stars, you can see that fringing popping up. I tried to evaluate how much of the actual chroma is happening near the edge, but I realized that because the lens gets so soft near the edge, you can see they're becoming more like wedge-shaped, but you don't really have a lot of definition to star points left anyway. So that's not great, but again, if you look at it globally, it's not fantastic, but it's usable. And so I would say that if you're on a budget and you purchase this lens, it may be the best lens in your kit for shooting the night sky, so go for it. And so as you can see from the deep dive, this is an old school kind of lens. And if that appeals to you, then fantastic. If it's not your cup of tea, thankfully for you, there's a lot of options out there. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.